What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about grounded theory. So some of the different forms of grounded theory, some of the differences between the different types of grounded theory, what might and might not be considered grounded theory, what the key differences are with some other types of analysis. But we're going to spend most of the time looking at a practical example about how we can create these kind of do some kinds of types of grounded theory in qualitative software using Qualitative as the example, but equally applicable to really any of the major qualitative analysis software packages. So without further ado, let's get in and see how that goes. So what actually is grounded theory? Well, that's a very good question, and it's one of those things where the literature describes it in lots of different ways, basically because there are lots of different approaches and lots of different things that fall under the kind of wider umbrella of grounded theory. So there's a really good article by Day, published in 1999, which we'll reference and give the list for at the end of this presentation. But he says there are probably as many versions of grounded theory as there are grounded theorists. So what does that mean? I mean, it means that basically it's a very flexible approach, and lots of people kind of mix and match different elements from different types of grounded theory to have something that works for the kind of research that they want to do, how they want to approach their epistemology, the kinds of data collection they want to do, the kind of theory generation they want to do. But there are commonalities throughout the approaches. The first OBE is that it comes down to grounded theory is about letting the data suggest the codes in the data. So you'll sometimes hear people talk about framework analysis or a priori coding, and that's kind of where you've got an idea ahead of time what the kind of codes and themes and topics and what kind of things you're going to be looking for in the data, usually because you've got a pre-existing theory, so you've got an idea about what you're going to find and why, and you want to test that theory against the data. Now, qualitative research can be very open-ended. It can have very open-ended questions, and it can use very open-ended data collection methods. What that means is that it's used a lot with grounded theory in particular, and some other similar approaches I'll talk about later, for generating new theories, or for going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, you know, on a controversial issue like vaccine hesitancy, let's pretend we have no preconceived ideas about why that might be. Let's just talk to people and see if we can't find something that's fresh and clear just by letting the data, so the respondents, the people we talk to, and kind of their words and our interpretation of their words suggest codes and then themes which can be used to drive and build new theory. And that's another commonality across all the different kinds of grounded theory, I would argue, is that they all propose starting with a kind of a smaller building block of analysis. So you kind of see these called codes or open codes or initial coding, depending on what type of grounded theory you're doing, and then building up to themes and building later into selective themes, or it would be the axial coding part of it. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but it's basically there are kind of multiple iterations in most kinds of grounded theory when you come to the analysis process, and that means starting out looking at the data, looking for very kind of simple and basic patterns and trends, and then kind of extrapolating those, looking at them more holistically and building up wider themes which connect better to theory. And we'll explain that a little bit when we do it a little bit later. So the first one to talk about is what's sometimes called CGT, so classical grounded theory. And this comes from the first paper on that kind of identified this phrase grounded theory, which is Glaser and Strauss. And both of them separately wrote separate treatises on how they viewed grounded theory after this. But this is where it kind of started from in the 60s. Again, the idea was that it was primarily going to be for generation of new theory. So you weren't coming it to pre-existing ideas about theory. And it also has a couple of things which kind of distinguish it from some of the other approaches. In this article, there's a very kind of strong focus on everything being data, even field notes, and field notes being a very important part of using that to generate your codes and theory. And the analysis process that they describe goes from looking at substantive theory, so substantive coding, to then build on later to theoretical coding. So it's quite similar to that pattern again, starting off with kind of small, basic, easy, simple codes, and then later on building them, pulling them together to build something larger. So that would be a very kind of rough guide to classical grounded theory. The question here is, have you already done a literature review? Because there's a lot of discussion between the different types of grounded theory as to whether doing a literature review and whether bringing in the literature, especially at the early stages of your research project, is kind of providing, it's kind of breaking grounded theory, because it's giving you kind of preconceived ideas about what's already out there in the literature and other theories, so you're not kind of developing your own from scratch. Some of the papers argue if you've already done a literature review, and often that's a prerequisite at a certain stage of people's PhD or writing a thesis, that a literature review is one of the first things that you do, and you write and show those chapters to your supervisors. So there's an argument that means that you probably shouldn't do classical grounded theory, because it would argue that while you do want to look at the literature, you want to look at that kind of after you've had a look at your data and after you've tried to generate some of those themes. Other people would argue about that interpretation, but that seems to be a kind of broad brush approach. So we'll then look at the Straussian modified grounded theory, which comes out with a Strauss and Corbin paper from 1990, but many others since then. And this is quite a similar approach in many ways. It's slightly more kind of prescriptive of its kind of steps, but it does argue that you can use pre-existing literature and look at pre-existing theories kind of early on in the process, not necessarily before you start, but at least quite early on in the process. Now that also doesn't talk so much about codes and themes, it talks about concepts and categories. The definition of those are slightly different, but they kind of amalgamous. And their approach for doing the coding, they talk about what's become a very common approach, which is the kind of open and axial coding. The open coding being you're open to interpretation, so going through and creating those very basic, simple first codes. And then the axial process where you're kind of connecting those together. And then from that selective coding, which is where you kind of start building the theory from those open themes which are being grouped together in an axial process. So there's a very kind of crude way to describe it, but that's the kind of approach which the kind of modified grounded theory is suggesting. And then after that you'll find the constructivist grounded theory. So Kathy Chalmers was the big proponent of this. She died very sadly quite recently. But she's a wonderful woman, and if you want to see any of her talks or read any of her papers, they're great. And I think one of the reasons that constructivist grounded theory has become so popular is she's got a very good kind of down-to-earth approach, and her writing is very clear and fun and easy to engage with, and her talks as well. So with constructivist grounded theory, you can also start with the literature if you want to. In fact, it's kind of encouraged. There's probably more of a reference to recognizing the role that the researcher has and the researcher's bias in creating these codes. The constructivist approach says that you're not really kind of discovering themes in the data. We'll talk about this a bit in a minute. But recognizing that the researcher is constructing them, and that's become quite a big kind of argument in the epistemological kind of side of these arguments recently. We'll see that as well. So what it's saying is that reflexivity is a very important part of that, because you want to acknowledge that it's not just the data speaking to an empty plate. You already have ideas in your head. You already have things that you're going to be interested in finding in the data, your own positionality, your own experiences, your own kind of biases and prejudices or privileges are going to come out in that process. So again, it's kind of rejecting a very kind of positivistic approach from the kind of very, very classical grounded theory, where you're saying the researcher is just a neutral party, just digging and finding things in the data. In constructivist grounded theory, the terms are different, but the process is quite similar to the modified grounded theory. So you talk first about open coding again, and then for Chalmers it becomes focused coding, and then from that to theoretical coding. Again, those processes differ slightly in their aims, but quite kind of a similar kind of, again, a kind of three-stage multi-iterative process. But there are many other forms of grounded theory, more than we have time to talk about today, because I want to kind of focus on a practical illustration of that. There's also feminist grounded theory, which uses not just kind of feminist method, but feminist kind of epistemology. There's postmodern approaches to grounded theory, and there's also things like discursive grounded theory, so combinations with other kind of methods of analysis looking at words and discourse and the context of discourse, which kind of give it a different spin. But it's also very possible to kind of create your own kind of modified grounded theory. So take some elements, justify why you want to use certain of them because of your epistemological stances and your ontological stances, and build something which works for your research questions, your research project, and the kind of theory building that you want to do. So one of the questions that I often get asked is how grounded theory is different from some of the other analytical approaches out there. And where it's obviously very different to framework analysis, where you've got those codes, you've got that coding structure, you've got your theories kind of ahead of time. The basics of the approach you'll see in a lot of other types of analysis. So reflexive thematic analysis, that's probably one of the most popular qualitative analysis methods which is used at the moment. You'll find a lot of commonalities with grounded theory in that. Again, the idea is to create new codes and themes from the data, not to start with too much kind of pre-existing concepts, but also to be very reflexive about it, so that kind of connects to the constructivist grounded theory argument again. And then you have content analysis. Again, some methods of content analysis. Some content analysis does have a priori kind of coding framework, and some of it is about creating codes on the fly as you go along. So that also have commonalities in approaches. And then IPA, so interpretive phenomenological analysis. Although what you're looking for and the theoretical concepts are quite different there, some of the kind of structures and processes can be quite similar. So IPA would take a line-by-line approach, so looking at each line, each kind of sentence, and trying to find kind of ways to summarize or describe that, sometimes even in using the participants' own words in vivo coding. And so there, although there is this kind of approach on kind of creating first, then this also quickly gets kind of mapped onto kind of codes and themes and so on. And the process of kind of creating these from scratch does make it feel quite similar to grounded theory. Again, there are commonalities. So do have a look at the different aspects, the different analytical approaches which are out there. See which ones you understand best, which fit your models best. And don't be too... don't get too far down the rabbit hole is one of the cautions that I usually make about this. There's a lot of debate in the literature about the semantics of how these different things are applied. Some of these are important and some of these are not. And it's important to know that there's, I would argue, quite a lot of posturing going on about describing particular things as being very different to very others. And that may be true from certain ontological approaches. But for many people, the practicalities of doing it and the outcomes will be quite similar. So understand your differences. Don't be afraid to have a kind of blended approach, as long as it's something that you understand well enough to justify why you've chosen to do that. So this was a very brief overview of some of the different grounded theory approaches. You can read a lot more in the blog post, which I'll put in the links below, which tries to give these kind of summaries. And that also references these two papers which I think are really good places to start. So the grounding theory by Day 1999 is really fun. It's an easy read, it's quite engaging, and that gives you a kind of a good overview as well. There's also an article which is freely accessible as well. And novice researchers first walk through the maze of grounded theory. That's Evans 2013. And that's just kind of a summary, kind of through their own journey, choosing classical grounded theory, but doing quite a good job at kind of describing some of the differences between the different grounded theory approaches as they go along. So I would encourage people who are taking this seriously not to just rely on some random guy's YouTube video to decide this very important part of their research process, but go back and read the proper sources, read the right literature, and then come to your own conclusions and decisions about what's the right method of analysis for you. So this is something which is become quite a big kind of topic in the literature recently. There's been a bit of a backlash against the term themes emerge from the data. Why is that? Well, partly this is an acknowledgement of the importance of the reflexivity in the process. And that some of the literature and some research, when it's describing themes as just emerging from the data, is kind of implying this very kind of positivistic stance where things are just there to be discovered, and the researcher's own biases and influences don't have a role in creating that. So you can even buy pins and badges which say themes do not emerge. So you can show your anti-positivist stance for when you're doing grounded theory. There's also a lot of people who talk about grounded theory not being suitable for using with qualitative data analysis software. I don't really understand those arguments. The qualitative software, there's a lot of discussion that it pushes you down a particular analytical path. I've not found one qualitative software, I've used pretty much all of them now, that I would say is trying to encourage one particular type of analysis over the other. Certainly the tutorials and manuals may show one approach more than another, but they can certainly all be made to do all the different types of grounded theory, I would argue. And again, it's about understanding that these are just tools, and the way that you use them as tools means that you can apply them to different approaches. Just like you would with knowing how to use a pen or a screwdriver or Word. Once you've mastered it, you can make it do anything you like. The important thing is not to get too distracted by the features of the software and let that dictate your analytical style. But in all the qualitative software, there are different ways that you can create codes and themes, differentiate between those codes and themes, remap and rework them, group them together to do open and axial coding and all these different approaches. So I would argue it doesn't really matter. I would not argue, some people try to, that there is one piece of software which is better for one particular type of grounded theory than another. I don't find within the capabilities of the software anything to really support that. I'm willing to be proven wrong, but so far I've not seen any evidence of it. So I'm now going to introduce Quirkos very quickly as one possible software tool. The basics are going to be similar for the other software packages out there, but Quirkos focuses on exploring and coding text data, so just small qualitative text projects. That's what it's aimed for, with a focus on not too many features, but it being quite easy to use and a very visual kind of approach. And some people like that kind of visual way of learning. And I'll show how that can help with some of those kind of later stages of grounded theory as well. The software is identical whether you're working on Windows, Mac and Linux. It comes from the Greek word for circle. The ethos is to try and make qualitative analysis more accessible, more open for more people. That's why I like kind of doing these overviews of some of these complicated topics, to try and make things more accessible for people getting into qualitative research. And also that people don't spend too much time faffing around with the software. The software should be there to help you read and code and understand and analyze your data, rather than just trying to do fancy graphs and kind of push you in a particular direction. So I'll show you how the codes and themes, which are represented by the bubbles in Quirkos, can kind of help with certain grounded theory approaches, how there are different kind of ways to kind of move and manipulate those to kind of help you build up towards your theory as you're going along and doing that. There are also options for memos and analytical text. Some forms of grounded theory think that the journal keeping, your research journal, your note taking, and memoing is a very important part of it. Some don't emphasize that as much, and I'm not going to talk too much about the reflexive writing process today. We're going to focus more on the kind of the codes and the coding, but they're there. So you can create memos, and you can also create a kind of ongoing research journal in Qualitative, and that can help with some of those processes. So let's go. Let's dive in, and let's see how this all looks in Qualitative. So what I've done today is just take one of our example projects, which are available on our website and free to download. The context of this hopefully doesn't matter too much for the little example that I'm going to do today, but it's people talking about the Scottish referendum for independence, which was back in 2014 now. And these are real interviews that we did with people who voted in the election one way or the other. But I'm going to try and draw out something that's a little bit of a kind of more broader social issue, and we're going to kind of see what kind of topics and themes which we're going to merge. And I've not done this before with this data and this extract of this data. I've not tried to analyze it in this way. So this is a proper kind of grounded theory kind of approach. I've also not done any kind of literature review on this. Although what I would probably want to do is start out with some kind of reflexivity statement, or at least go through a reflexivity procedure where I'm acknowledging my own kind of political leanings, my positionality, my privileges, things that might end up being subconscious biases. And so that's something that would be kind of part of the process. Very important for me, possibly not for some kinds of grounded theory, but that's up to you, for you to describe. Some of the classical grounded theory would describe too much focus on reflexivity as being a distraction from the data. I think it's difficult to, most people, it's difficult to get to too much reflexivity, I think, but yeah, I mean, there's the potential for it. Everybody likes to talk about themselves, but it's unlikely to distract most people from the data, I think. I don't really hold on to that argument. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at this one section of data here, which is talking about whether this particular respondent, Adrian, that's not their real name, this is a real interview, feels that the vote, so voting yes for independence or no for Scotland to stay as part of the UK, whether there was there were trends along income lines. So if more richer and affluent people were more likely to vote one way than people of lower income or people in poverty. So this is something that we can draw out over the course of hopefully just a couple of paragraphs. And what we're going to do first is, it doesn't really matter too much kind of which terminology I use that, so please don't focus too much on that. So we're going to do initial kind of codes. So those classical grounded theory you would describe as substantive codes. In modified grounded theory, these would be your open codes, and same in constructivist coding, and some others as well. So we're going to start with some open coding. So you can see we've got, in Quirkos, we've got the source of text here on the right, and then we've also got here, this is what we call the canvas area. So this is where we create the codes and eventually themes. And this is blank. So we've not created any codes. We're jumping straight into the data here, and we're going to get straight into that. One of the other things I mentioned is that a lot of forms of grounded theory will also have prescriptions about how you recruit data, how you sample for the data, and that there should be some kind of engagement between kind of a comparative approach, going between collecting new data, analysing, collecting new data. And that's something else we're not going to get into too much today. But today we're just going to look at this one source, and we're just going to see what kind of codes that we can pull out in a kind of grounded theory way. So the interviewer, and that was me, says, do you think that there was variation within Edinburgh? Are they talking about... Okay, so this was originally talking about regions, so there wasn't a leading question here to talk about income, affluence, or anything like that. So do you think there was variation within Edinburgh? I haven't seen any analysis, but I would suspect there was. I think the affluent middle-class suburbs would have voted no. So to stay in the United Kingdom, so voting no to Scottish independence. And while Leith, parts of Leith, Pilton and Craigmillar would have voted yes. I suspect, but that's pure speculation. So what am I going to pull out here? So I haven't seen any analysis. So I actually think that this is probably a code. Now I've read this other sentence, I already want to make this code speculation, but let's say we're going to create a code and we're going to call this uninformed. And in Quirkos there's a tool which is very useful for this kind of initial coding process, where you can create a new code by dragging and dropping a section of text onto the plus button. And that creates a new code with that text already in it. So we're going to call this uninformed. So, okay, I'm already, I think, themes are not emerging. I'm branding them. My researcher, I'm saying this person is uninformed. Even though they say I haven't seen any analysis. If we're doing something like IPA or in vivo coding, we might use those own words. So no analysis, or personal opinion maybe another way to describe it. But let's do some terrible coding because we can learn from that. So let's call this uninformed. So I haven't seen any analysis, so this person was uninformed, but I suspect there was. Okay, so it's not really clear what that's referring to. But I'm going to actually put all of that in a code which we'll call variation. And we're going to put a description in here because variation could be for anything, but we'll call this variation in how people vote. So it's just a little bit clearer what that is. And we can change the colour, but we'll just leave that for now. So I've got these two bubbles. If you've not used Quirkos before, they're created with random colours in a random place. And we can drag and move them around. So we're just going to move them a little bit closer here. I think the affluent middle class suburbs would have voted no. And well, Leith, parts of Leith, Pilton and Craigmillar would have voted yes. So those are actually poorer kind of districts in Edinburgh. So how could we could pull this out in a couple of ways. I think the affluent middle class suburbs would have voted no. So we'll put this into no voters. So this is sections of text of people talking about people voting no, and we could put it somewhere else as well. So I think we'll also put this in. We'll call this. We'll use the participant's own word, which is affluent. Affluence. Okay. Well, Leith, parts of Leith, Pilton and Craigmillar would have voted yes. So we'll take that section, and we'll also put that in. Okay, so we'll create another code here called yes voters, and we'll put that in interactive coding on the fly. I hope this is exciting for you. And we'll put this in. Okay, so it's not described what that would be. So unaffluent. I don't know. So you can see already that one of the issues with open coding is it being quite difficult to not use your own words and your own terminology to describe what someone else is saying. So here this was easy because they used the word affluent. But they didn't, it was explicit within the context of the sentence that this person was talking about the opposite of affluence, but they didn't say poor or impoverished or any particular word that we could use that would kind of accurately describe how they would probably describe that. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I suspect that that's pure speculation. So I'm going to put this in a new code called speculation. Okay, so we have two sentences, one answer, and we created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 codes out of that. So the open coding process can be quite expansive like this. let's try and, before we go on to the next sentence, kind of pull this across a little bit and see what's going on. So this doesn't make a lot of sense to me at the moment. I'm going to put the no and yes voters kind of a little bit together. And this is one of the things that I quite like about using Quirkos for this kind of open coding process, is that you can move things around and put them together in ways that make sense, not necessarily thematically yet, but that might start to be thematic. And so that can kind of make things start to come together. And we've got, so affluence and unaffluent we're going to put together. Uninformed and speculation we're going to put together. We're just going to put variation as kind of being a separate thing. But what we could do, no, we'll leave it just there for now. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see these a bit clearer, because it'll probably be a bit small on your screen. Okay, so we might go through and use these same codes again. I think income would be influential, right? So that's going to be about variation. You can see that, so the relative sizes shows you how much has been coded here. People who have a good lifestyle and things are okay as they were, whereas who are less off. So the government introduced these changes to the welfare system, the bedroom tax and all that kind of thing. People say, what's Westminster done for us? And that's concentrated in areas of impoverishment because it only affects you if you're in a council house. So this is, he's talking, well, let's just pull this out. Again, it's one of those things where the way that they've spoken, it's not very clear if you just pull out particular extracts what they're talking about. But this is about affluence. So let's take that bit, put it in affluence, and that makes them actually more likely to be no voters. Oh, sorry, so it's not affluent. So I'm going to undo that, remove that, and that needs to go in. I'm going to put that in unaffluent. Okay, so we've got these terrible themes here. Don't worry, we're going to come back and look at these. Of course, the much more harsh principles on which benefits were allocated again will be affecting people in areas living where benefits are an important issue. So this is again about unaffluent people. It's a horrible term. Let's change that in a minute. I think Edinburgh tended to support the No campaign because Edinburgh's got pretty well full employment. Well, it's not full. There's a lot of unemployment in Edinburgh. See, it's starting to ramble a little bit. So we'll just take that a little bit and we'll put that in. That's about variation. It's about no voters. It's about affluence again. But I'm also going to put this in Edinburgh because we don't have a category for that. But it's probably an important thing that we look at. So we've got an Edinburgh code there. I thought, well, there's not a lot of employment in Edinburgh. Whereas in Glasgow in the west there is unemployment. So in Dundee, which is beginning to rise again, there's still quite a lot of variation. So I'm going to put this bit. We'll create a new one which is called Glasgow. Create another one which is called Dundee. Again, I'm trying to come to this blank, but I know people are going to be talking about these cities later on, so it's worth creating codes for these. And I'm going to put this in unaffluence. Right, okay, so right, we've done quite a bit of coding. Actually, we didn't create too many new codes in that new section, so that's good. But we've got these now. Can't say I'm particularly happy with them. That's okay. Unaffluent, so I don't really like this, especially how I've spelled it. So what we can do is we'll right click and we'll change the name of this, and I think we'll say wealthy. Now again, this is kind of like a controversial part of the open coding process. So as we go along, we may be creating lots of new codes, and that's fine, but we may find that the codes just need to be described in better ways, and that's okay. It's a natural kind of part of the process. Or that we need to merge some of the codes together. And a good example of that here is this speculation and uninformed. I mean, I really think they're the same thing. I slightly prefer the speculation term. I don't really like either of those, because he did use the speculation term himself. So I'm going to right click on uninformed, and I'm going to merge that into speculation. Where is it? There. Okay, I don't need to change the colour or anything like that. Right, so I've put those two bits there, speculation, and didn't do any analysis together as kind of speculation. So I'm already kind of here beginning to, I wouldn't say that was kind of building towards anything. I don't think this is starting to be a kind of axial coding or creating something, some kind of like high level thing. It's not really very focused. It's just really kind of putting together open codes that are just very similar. And there'll be a lot of that. For example, I created all these codes for Edinburgh, Dundee and Glasgow. These are just cities in Scotland that were mentioned. I think they'll probably be important later on because I think people will also refer to these cities because they voted very differently. But that's because I've got a preconceived idea in my head. I probably would have created the codes anyway. But if it turns out that it's not necessary to have those, we may just create one code which is cities. It may be that cities and rural regions are going to be more important than actually specifying which city somebody comes from. And we've got yes voters here and we've got no voters. I think that's going to be fine as is. We'll probably want to see the different things which people claim yes voters and no voters are saying. There may also be the issue about, are people talking about themselves, or people kind of implying they understand how others think? That might be something else that we want to look at here as well. But anyway, this has been a fairly typical kind of open coding session, I would say. Substantive coding, or however you want to describe it. And so we did a kind of grounded theory. We went through and we started kind of creating codes without kind of an idea about what codes we were going to create. I hadn't looked at this data with this kind of eye before. We're not going to look at any more data from this project because I want to kind of focus just on these paragraphs. But is there any way we can kind of build this into something else? Is this suggesting something already? Well, I kind of think it is. I mean, if I was to describe what this person had said to you, I would say, I could probably describe it in a very simple sentence. I could say, this person thinks that the people who voted yes were more likely to be impoverished because they were unhappy with the political system. They felt the political system hadn't helped them well enough. And you could describe that the other way around. You could say, I think this person thinks that people voted no or to stay with the UK because they were well off, the government looked after them, so they didn't see a need for change. Okay. So how can I kind of bring those codes, so the idea about variation, the idea about kind of like poverty is really the divider, or income is the divider. So let's I think that's good actually. So let's talk about income, and we'll say this is financial because it could be something else. Oops, and we'll zoom out now because my code's just going to pop over the place. So we've got this thing called income. And income may actually start being a kind of higher level theme. So that might be something which is kind of axial because it's beginning to bring things together. There may be higher levels above that. So income might be, actually what are we really talking about income? We're talking about inequality. Is that not really what this is talking about? Now you might say that I'm jumping to conclusions based on just reading 2 paragraphs of one interview, and you're absolutely right. This is a process that I'd probably start reflecting on after I'd done open coding across all the different interviews. But for the sake of the exercise today, I'm just looking at 2 paragraphs. So basically for me, let's move this away. So we have these themes, these codes, wealthy and variation. These could become themes, and my kind of selective code or my theoretical kind of level could be inequality. And that kind of makes sense to me. So I can just group things a little bit like this, just by keeping them close together in Quirkos, by dragging them around. And until I'm kind of sure, that's usually how I do things in Quirkos. When I come to that stage, I'm kind of coding my codes, I'm reading through, I'm trying to connect things, trying to build theory, trying to do the axial side of things. So what I could also say is that inequality, there are various different types of inequality. Income is one of them. So I'm going to drag and drop income onto there. I'm actually going to drag wealthy, I'm going to put variation there, sorry, and influence there. So I've now created subcategories So under inequality, I've got income, and under income, I've got affluence and wealthy, because it may very well be that there are other forms of inequality which are important here. So inequality could be around race. So that could be something that comes out later, we could say. So that would want to be, you know, in this open axial mode, that might be something that starts connecting together. We start to see elements of racism coming through, and we want to talk about those as different types of inequality. And we may also take, I don't even know, like maybe education. So all of these could be different kind of factions of inequality, which are kind of building us towards a theory of why people are voting a certain way. But there's something else. There's something even higher than this, I think. And that is this kind of thing which this person's talking about here. The government introduced all these changes to the welfare system. And because it only affects you if you're in a council house. So there's this concept that the government is not providing. The government is the cause of this inequality, or at least the government is not fixing it. So it's let's call it dissatisfaction with government. Now you could call this liberalism. You could call this a bunch of different kind of political states, but what this person is really saying here, I can drag and drop this text there to actually give that example there, is that he thinks that people vote a particular way based on whether they are satisfied or dissatisfied with the current government, and whether they want the government and the political system to change. So I would argue that that's, at least for this participant, that's kind of their theory to explain what's going on here. And so that's what I've tried to pull through this process. With my open codings, I was just looking at these very basic things, so like income, and there were also specific things that we could look up here. Council housing, so as an example of, and the welfare state, the welfare system. Yeah, let's not have, right, so let's put that in council housing as well, but let's rename that welfare system, because those are both factions of the welfare system, and that the people who are relying on the welfare system are not very happy right now, and so they will want to change government. But if you're already rich, you've got a good job, then you're not particularly looking for an income, a change in the government. And what I suspect we'll see, knowing this data, as we go through and talk about that, is that that's certainly one thing that people have talked about, but then there are a lot of other factors that people talk about. People talk about pride, people talk about nationalism, they talk about freedom. So those are different things to being dissatisfied with the welfare system, really. So I'm already kind of connecting these kind of things together in my head. But that's the kind of process that in grounded theory that we'll do. And I think it's very important when you're going through and doing the analysis and coding process is to try and play, to try and explore different things that might explain this, create new theories, see if they're kind of like fitting your open codes, and if not, going back and trying something else. So, you know, I created this dissatisfaction with government. Well, I created the inequality one first, and then dissatisfaction with government, and then the welfare system. So all these things were kind of building towards something which eventually could be a kind of even higher kind of theoretical thing than dissatisfaction with government, because that could talk about independence or some freedom or some other things as well. So this was a very kind of quick and crude example, just because I think it becomes very abstract when you're just reading the papers which just describe the different approaches between different types of grounded theory, and it helps to kind of see some of the problems that you come up with, like labeling codes and which one of these are codes and which one of these are themes. And one of the things that you would do in Quirkos is you can create groups. So I would often do codes is a group, and another one which is called themes. So yes voters, for me that's a code, and no voters, that's also a code. So I can assign any of these codes to the groups. Dissatisfaction with government, this is beginning to become a theme. And actually I don't think the welfare system is. I think that's probably something very descriptive, so I think that's going to stay as a code. But inequality, I think that's That's kind of like a higher level theme for me, so that's going to be a theme. And so what I can do now is I can choose which group that I show. So it may later on be that you don't want to see all these codes anymore, you just want to see your themes, your kind of higher level concepts, because it will get very busy if you've got hundreds of open codes. But there may also be some things, like dissatisfaction with government. I mean, this could also be a code. I mean, people could just be straight up saying that they don't like the government. And that could also be something which is a higher level thing. So these dissatisfaction government would appear as a code and a theme, so it's going to appear in both of those. So you've got those groups as well as the hierarchies of being able to drag codes onto each other and group them that way. And also just again, remember the physicality of moving things kind of close together can help in a way that doesn't kind of set your mind into this is a subset of that. So I find that kind of like a bit more flexible. And you can also play with the colours as well. So you can give, these cities kind of distinctive colours, or all the cities different shades of orange, so you know that those are codes. Those are cities. There's lots of different ways that you can play with those in the software and kind of explore those a little bit. So that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about today. If you've got any questions or anything else you'd like me to demonstrate, do put them in the chat right now. I'll have a quick look and see if there's something I can demonstrate now. If you do want to try Quirkos, you can go straight to our website. You can download a free trial and you can see exactly how that works for you. There's no restrictions on the free trial. It's 21 days for the offline license and 14 days with the cloud subscription. There's a lot of more materials on the website. So the blog we've got there, I'll put a link in the description as well. The blog not only talks about Quirkos, but all these different things, so grounded theory and IPA and all these different things. And there's also a lot of resources there for doing methods as well. So talking about doing interviews and tips for focus groups and so on. So there's a lot of resource there. There's also lots of free tutorials and ways for you to learn Quirkos and apply some of these different approaches. So do go and have a look at the website. It's www.quirkos.com and see if that's something that might help you on your qualitative research journey. So thanks for coming along today. No questions in the chat, so I'll end the session here. But thanks so much for coming along, and don't forget to check out Quirkos.